Are you a serious dinosaur collector who wants to make better buying decisions? If so, this is a show for you. Welcome to episode 13 of the Dinosaur Review Show.
Today we're going to be talking about Protoceratops. Protoceratops is a ceratopsian, just like Triceratops, that lived in Mongolia.
Before we dive into it, George, what is the fossil record we're dealing with today?
Exceptional. If you guys have ever heard of the griffin, which is a half eagle, half lion, the myths were actually originated from Protoceratops skeletons that travelers saw going through the Silk Road. And we have so many complete skeletons of Protoceratops over clutches of eggs, even fighting a velociraptor.
Okay, George, we have 5 models to look at today, including 3 from beasts of the Mesozoic. Let's start with the Papo figure.
I actually didn't know that Papo made a Protoceratops.
I believe it was just released in 2022.
Alright, so this Protoceratops figure, it's pretty small, but then again, Protoceratops was a very small dinosaur. It's about the size of a sheep. In comparison, Triceratops was a little bit bigger than a rhino. I will say it does have articulation in its jaw, so it opens up, and look at those pearly whites. It's got teeth. So one of the weird things about ceratopsians is that they have teeth, batteries that run up their cheeks, and they can have hundreds of teeth at any given time, ready to be replaced. The beak proportions are a little different than what I'm used to seeing, and the cheekbones are also a bit more pronounced. The frill, however, is very good in proportions, and it kind of has these bullseye targets on them, which are probably there to intimidate predators into thinking that like something bigger is looking right back at it. If we look along the back, it has these interesting scale or osteoderm patterns. The tail is consistent with what we find in the fossil record. It does have these tall spines going up from the end of the tail. If we look at its limbs, you can see it has 5 toes and 4 toes in the back. So this is accurate. In later ceratopsians, so this guy is from the late Cretaceous, so basically right before T-Rex, about 70 million years ago. But after that, ceratopsians started losing toes in the front, so that's a very interesting thing.
How did they lose toes in the front?
Well, as they got heavier, they developed foot pads to help them walk, but when you're lighter, you need all the mobility and dexterity that you can get, so that's what fingers offer. I'm looking at the scales, and it's pretty consistent throughout. Now, the only things we know about ceratopsian scales are what we know about Triceratops, and they do have this hexagonal figure all around them. Bottom, however, should look more like square scales, so we don't see that here. But yeah, that's the Papo Protoceratops.
What do you think of the belly color, George? The brighter green jumping out at you?
It's reminiscent of an iguana, and iguanas are tropical, and there's nothing in the paleo environment that tells us that Protoceratops lived in a tropical environment. In fact, it was a pretty dry environment, much like where the fossils are found now, in the Gobi Desert.
Let's take a look at the CollectA model, George.
We're moving up in size. Look at this. Now, I want to say I like this coloration a bit better. Notice how I said it was a much drier environment back then. Think of like a savanna. Not entirely a desert, but also not entirely lush. If we start with the head, see the frill also has kind of like that eye pattern. This one looks more like an owl, but owls didn't exist back then, so it's probably trying to do that mimicry of there's a bigger creature looking right back at you. And speaking of looking right back at you, look at its eyes. I like that kind of dark color of its eyes. It even has a shine to it. The mouth also articulates, so it opens, and it has that skin flap that connects it, so it looks very seamless. Oh, and look at the teeth. That is a very accurate representation of their teeth. They have these 2 prongs on each side, and then followed by molars in the back that would help them eat their food. Their cheekbones are exposed, which is something that we see in a lot of ceratopsians. They're exposed at the ends, and they're covered in skin at the front. Now, if we follow the back ridge, you see that those spines are there, but the difference is these are quills, which are found in a relative called Psittacosaurus. They had these quills, which are much like feather quills. Like if you've ever written with a pen, that pen tip is what these guys probably would have been made out of, but no soft stuff like the top of the feather. If we look at the feet, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, the difference with these is that the front 3 have the hoof, and the side 2 do not. This is consistent with other ceratopsians like Triceratops and Pentaceratops. I do like that they did that. We're going with what we know versus what we don't know, and that's typically a safer bet And looking at the back, we have the same thing. We have the 3 toes in the front that have hooves. The side one also has a hoof, but it's the inner one. And while we're here, look what it is, a cloaca.
Alrighty.
Yeah, we got one, which is very important because we do know that Protoceratops laid eggs. Another thing I want to point out is the skin texture is different from the bottom moving up to the top. The bottom ones are more square and the top ones are more round, and they have those osteoderms that I've talked about. These osteoderms are bony plates that are in the scales of this guy, so that's pretty cool. I'd say I like this one, and it's a lot bigger than other figures that I've seen. Well,
Let's take a look at the first 2 figures from Beasts of the Mesozoic. They are actually the same figure. They just come in different colors.
oh, these are tiny,
Actually, they're not the same figure. I'm seeing some differences right off the top of my head.
or right off of the top of their heads. So that is actually due to these 2 being different species. There are 2 different species of Protoceratops that are found. One of them has the round top of the frill, and the other one has a concave feature at the top of the frill. The one we're most familiar with is the rounded top one. That one is the one that, if you've heard of this fossil, it's called the dueling dinosaurs. It's a velociraptor locked in battle with a Protoceratops, and this is the one it's fighting. So when you asked me earlier about the fossil record of them, that's how I know so much about these guys. Let's start with the one we've been reviewing so far, the one with the rounded frill. Look at the amount of detail on this little figure. I think these are 1 to 18th scale,
Correct.
I believe. And this figure does open its mouth, so that's one of the points of articulation. Its frill does not have the circular eye coloration patterns. Instead, it goes for more of a stripy appearance. I do like that the cheekbones are proportionate. They should never extend past the frill. If you look at the back, they do have these ridges running all alongside the spine into the top of the tail. This one does not have quills, but I can see quills being very tricky on a figure this small. And looking at the feet, we have the top 3 toes have the hooves, whereas the 2 back ones not. Again, we're going with what we know versus what we don't know. So that's a very accurate front limb, and the back ones, we have 4 toes, all of them with hooves, even the inner ones. Again, we don't know whether the inner one would have had a hoof, although actually I'm pretty sure they do. I'm thinking of just the front ones, but the back ones do. I'm correcting myself there. No cloaca, but not all of them have it. And look at these limb articulation. You can literally pose it to stand. You can literally pose it to stand in different ways, whether it's in a walking position or even a running position. And wow, I just noticed this, but the torso also articulates slightly. Well, that's really cool. Oh, and I've almost forgot that the neck also moves, so you can have it posed looking right back at you. And to add on to the posability and articulation, they also come with some extra legs, which these limbs are actually the calves for the back. So if you wanted a different pose, you can add it on just by popping in this where the other leg would have gone. So it's nice that these come with the extra feature of additional limbs. Time to look at the other variant of Protoceratops from Beasts of the Mesozoic. So this one not only is a different color, but it's also a different species. The Protoceratops we've been looking at so far are Protoceratops Andrewsi, and the one we're looking at now is Protoceratops Hellenikorhinus. So this guy lived a little bit before Protoceratops Andrewsi, just about 1 million years or so before.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, the skulls are very different in the frill section. So this one has a concave feature to the frill. And the cheekbones are also not as pronounced. They're kind of just nubs on the side instead of sticking out like the other Protoceratops figures. And this one also doesn't have the articulation in the beak. But if you notice, they have little bumps on their brows and their nose. They're kind of like little proto horns on a Protoceratops. I love it. It has the same points of articulation as the previous one, as in the tail, the body, and the head, and the limbs. And speaking of the limbs, they have the same kind of features on the feet as the previous one. And just like the previous one, it comes with spare parts. 2 different Protoceratops species from the same company.
All right, George, let's take a look at the last figure from Beast of the Mesozoics, the oversized one.
Look at this Beast of the Mesozoic. Man, I'm going to have to adjust the camera for this one again. Let's see. This is a beautiful Protoceratops figure. I look at the way it's looking at you. Those beautiful blue eyes just stare into your soul. Now, I do want to point out that this one does have a jaw articulation. Again, this is Protoceratops Andrewsoni, so it is going to have that rounded frill at the top, except now you can see that it has these osteoderms all over the frill. And if you look at the front, you see that nose bump is a lot more pronounced, or at least easier to see on this figure. We got nostril there. Let's look at the feet. So we have the 3 hoofed ones in the front, 2 non-hoofed on the side, very good, and then the 4 hoofed ones in the back, very consistent with the other figures. Now you may notice that there is no tail, but that's because the tail comes as a separate attachment that you as a user can add on. But for the purpose of this review, we won't do that. Instead, we'll look at the features of the tail separately. Notice these spines. They're sticking out from the tail out into the surface. So we don't have evidence that they would have done that, but we do have evidence of their relatives having kind of like these spines coming up, but they're more like quills instead of bone. So that's a little bit not accurate, in my opinion, of these. Still, the scale pattern is very much accurate. See, in the previous videos that we've talked about ceratopsians, Triceratops skin has been found that has kind of square scales on the bottom. You can see that a bit better in the bigger figure. And then it has round scales on the top. Yeah, I gotta say, look at the proportions on that. It's a very, very healthy looking Protoceratops.
All right, George, mugshot time. Let's take a look at the heads. Anything jumping out at you?
Yes, the proportions on the heads are all different. If we look at the larger figure, the skull proportions are a lot larger. And when I mean that, it's wider. So the frill sticks out more to the side from the large beast of the Mesozoic. The CollectA is in a different pose, but it also isn't as tall in proportion to the rest of its skull, whereas the Papo one, it is very, very tall in comparison to all the other ones in proportions. But the smaller figures, it seems like it's very well proportionate to their body. So I gotta say that the skull's proportions are very different throughout the figures.
How about the overall accuracy of the head and frills? Are any of them jumping out at you as either accurate or inaccurate?
I will say that the Papo ones, the cheekbones stick out too much. They go past the frill, which we really don't see in Protoceratops. The other figures seem to do a better job at that, keeping it within the frill range, but the Papo one sticks out too much, so I would say that's inaccurate. It also doesn't have a bony sheath covering like the other ones do, which would have had a very big importance to defending itself. So that is not present. So I would say that the Papo one is the most inaccurate when it comes to that.
How about the beak shape and integration into the skull? Are those all accurate?
I gotta say, Beasts of the Mesozoic is doing the better job on this with all of their figures. They have a good amount of beak exposed versus skin coverage. The CollectA figure seems like it exposed too much, so I'm personally not a fan of that. The Papo one, it did good, but it went more for like a parrot-like proportion, which they did have parrot-like beaks, but the proportions weren't like that of a parrot's.
So generally, I'm hearing that the Papo one is the most inaccurate head sculpt.
I would say so. Yes.
All right, let's take a look at the skin and textures, George. Anything jumping out at you?
Yes, so the Papo one, since we were talking about that more recently, its scales are just all over the place, but they are the easiest to see. It doesn't seem proportionate to the Protoceratops. They seem like too large of scales for such a small dinosaur, whereas the other figures have smaller scales in proportion to their body size. So it's like they added an adult dinosaur's scales to a baby dinosaur. The CollectA has osteoderms, which we've seen in Triceratops, and I do like that, but again, we don't have evidence that its earlier relative would have had them. So I'm kind of on the fence on that one, but they do get bonus points for those quills on the tail.
Let's take a look at the tails. You mentioned the quills on the CollectA as being the most accurate.
Yes. So they follow the spines that the tail vertebrae have, but they also add quills toward the end. Now, this is a dinosaur that has a frill protection, but no horns. It has no offensive capabilities besides those quills. If you think of a porcupine, if you have a spiky butt, other animals won't want to eat you. So I see those as a defensive measure. But again, only its relatives had it. We don't know if Protoceratops had it. So again, it's a personal preference, and a scientific conjecture on that. The other tails, I would say, are pretty accurate. They all follow that famous Protoceratops rise in the tail vertebrae and dip. So I'd say they all pass.
Let's take a look at the feet, George. Are the toe counts correct on all the figures?
They are all correct on the toe counts. But I hate to single out the Papo one, but the Papo one added hooves on all the fingers, which, is taking a certain liberty since most ceratopsians that we find only have hoof on the front 3 toes. All the other figures have 3 hoofs in the front and then 2 non-hoofs on the side. So it's the outlier in this group.
Okay, George, decision time. Assuming money is no object, which figure are you going to add to your collection?
If money was no object, I'd probably go for any of the beasts of the Mesozoic. I really like their accuracy and their articulation. I'd probably get the smaller one since Protoceratops was one of the smallest in the family of horned dinosaurs. So I really like the 1/18 scale.
All right, that concludes this episode. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Have you ever worked directly with any of these fossils, George?
Not fossils, but I have worked with their casts. I've recently worked on a Protoceratops over an egg nest. It's a cast, so it's a replica of the original. But one of my many talents is color matching the fossil color to paint onto the cast. So that's something that I've done.
That's an interesting specialty. Explain that in more detail, please, George.
Gladly. So when we make copies of fossils, we want to use them for either education or display, but nobody wants just a plain white fossil to look at. So that's where I come in. I would color match the fossil and the rock and dirt where it originated from using paint and sand. Sometimes I even use other kinds of grit to add that sort of texture. I've used sea sponges to kind of add a mottled effect, but basically you want to make it look as close to the original as possible, so that way people can get the feeling of, wow, I'm looking at the real thing. But we remind them it's just a replica.